I'm Javier Espinosa, Europe Executive Editor at the Capital Forum, and today we are doing the interview series. It's a great pleasure to introduce Nuno Cunha Rodrigues, head of the Portuguese Competition Authority, joining us in Washington.
Thank you, Javier, for having me. It's my pleasure.
Very good to see you. Our second interview.
Right, always a pleasure to talk with you.
Not the one on this series, but we have done a lengthier conversation at your office in Portugal. And today I want to focus our conversation on the hottest topic that we are all talking about in this conference, which is AI and the role of competition. Tech, clearly of huge interest to our audience. And in particular, I want to explore this idea of this tech stack and how influential competition authorities outside the Brussels sort of regulatory landscape are understanding this issue. So, first of all, tell us what this tech stack is.
Yeah, let me go back a few years ago, 70 years ago, to a guy called Hans Moravec. He found a paradox when dealing with technology and computers, that computers were able to do this enormous calculus that a human being was not able to in just a few seconds, a huge mathematician calculus. But on the other hand, computers were not able to distinguish a cat from a dog, which we are. And why do we have that capacity? Because we have eyes, we have ears, we have nose, we have senses that computers don't have. So by then, 70 years ago, they tried to understand how can we imitate, replicate this human thought in order to distinguish a cat from a dog. And we cannot make it like an equation or a calculus. So the thing is by learning. Machines could learn how to distinguish a cat or a dog, similar to a child, what a child does. But a child to learn and a machine to learn has to have data, has to have information. And the more information you get, the more accurate and precise is your distinguish between, again, a cat or a dog. And that started the concept of machine learning. So it's not something that scientists know now. It's already known for several years ago. The thing is now mankind has data that didn't have 70 years ago and has the capacity to process all that data and to advance this learning, this machine learning. Which is now what we call artificial intelligence. And now we have the possibility that with that data, we can produce new data without human intervention. You can have new images, video, music, codes that are produced by machines. And that's when generative AI comes. And it comes to help us in our work, in our daily lives. And it really changed the things that society is able now to do. And it will have a huge impact in the future in the way we perform, in the way we act in society, this generative AI. So we as authorities try to map how this technology works, how it works. And it has a kind of a stack, what we call the AI stack, which is based on chips, the famous GPUs, because the GPUs are the only one that can perform all this information and can process all this information that it's needed. It's needed also to have cloud computing, the way to process all the information. Of course, you need to have access to data, and you have to have know-how. People that know about this and know how to can transform and use all this data. So this is what we call the AI stack, and we try to map this AI stack in order to understand the possible competition concerns that it can have. And we did it at the Portuguese authority. So when this new technology came out, and several brands, ChatGPT, Gemini, all that Copilot, when they came out, the authorities tried to learn how they work and the possible concerns that they may arise. So we did a short paper series at the Portuguese authority, one about labor markets, another one about chips, another one about access to data, another one about open models. And at the end, we realized, there's a serious risk of entrenchment in this tech. The big tech firms can entrench their power, their market power, because they are the ones that have access to data, that have the compute power and all that. So at the end, this might raise several competition concerns and very worrying competition concerns in the future, similar to the ones that happened 20 years ago, but by then we were not aware of those risks that now are in view of everyone.
Perhaps the authorities were more naive back then. But
Yeah.
why look at this in the first place? Why, I'm sure you have to allocate resources. Why is this an area of concern?
It's an because it will have a huge impact on the choices of consumers, on the way that we work. You have to see that each by year, the GDP that is spent in the digital economy is being growing more and more. So everyone in our daily life depend more and more on digital economy. And I do think that generative AI will be the next digital frontier for our societies, the same way as digital platforms were 20 years ago. Now we see the risk of coming the so-called agentic AI, which will replace the consumer when choosing goods and services. So each one of us will trust on its agentic AI to do their own choices. So you see the impact that it might have in all the activity, the economic activity, and the consumption of goods and services. So that's why we, as authorities, need to understand, to map the sector, and now possibly to intervene if needed.
Tell me, before we talk about the intervention, because you have deeply analyzed and spent a lot of time and resources to do that, what is the key learning that you have come?
The key learning is that throughout the stack, there are many firms that have a dominant position in that stack and have a really important and huge market power. So we need to understand how they are performing, what they are doing, in order possibly to use the toolbox that we have as authorities. And I'm referring, for example, to Article 102, possible abuses, exploitative abuse or extraordinary abuses. We can impose interim measures. For example, the French did so in a famous case, Google versus the publishers. So we can impose interim measures in order to do a time to market intervention, or we can talk with the commission so that they can apply the DMA, because many of those firms that are performing in the generative AI sector are the same. They are considered gatekeepers. So again, in terms of partnerships, acqui-hires, for example, it's also a problem we are facing nowadays. We have seen the famous case Microsoft Inflection, where they are buying all these human resources, engineers, instead of buying the firm. They are buying those people, those workers, and if they are considered to be assets, then you are under the merger review control. So again, Javier, what we are doing is try to map and now learning and understanding how we can intervene again if needed.
When does it become, for an authority in your assessment, time to act? Because as you say, you have been learning a lot.
When you see there is a possible abuse, when you see firms that have, I would say, 90% of the market share, and you've seen them realizing that, and they are using that power in terms of abuse, not only of competitors, exclusionary abuse, but also of consumers, of, for example, providing access to data. One of the conclusions that we reached during our studies is that, for example, it's important to have open models that are open to new firms that can offer their goods and services through the generative AI technology. And I refer, for example, for plugins. The same way as we have apps in our mobile phones, you can have plugins in generative AI that are used for financial services, for all types of services. Mm-hmm. And it's important to have open models that can provide access to those newcomers, new entrants to provide their services to the society.
Do you detect appetite among your counterparts in Europe of wanting to move into this space?
I think so. We have few resources. We don't have many resources. We have to allocate and prioritize our resources, of course. And the Portuguese authority is doing that. So you have to take care of the so-called bread and butter stuff or cartels or that happen. So we cannot allocate much resources to this task. But we are working hand in hand with other authorities. For example, the French are doing a great job here. The UK, the CMA, they also have mapped this sector. In Denmark, for example, but other countries are doing that. And of course, we have within the European Union the ECN, the European Competition Network. So we are exchanging information and learning each other from the work that we've been doing.
How do you balance this need and awareness of intervening in a market potentially if you spot any alleged abuse, and the development of these industries on data? For example, in Portugal, I know that there's efforts by NVIDIA and Microsoft to create a new data center that surely will generate areas, will potentially create jobs. How do you balance these
So
two?
it's important to have those data centers. Those are fundamental for the deployment of the technology. But we have to see if those data centers are being built or created in a standalone basis or integrated within the stack of a firm. If it's on a standalone basis, of course, I think there is no problem. There's competition between data centers, which is important for the deployment again of this technology. But if they are integrated or vertically integrated with a firm that is creating them, then we have to understand the possible impact that it has in competition. For example, are those data centers available for competitors to have access to the data? How is that data treated? Again, it's important to have those data centers. It's a huge investment. It's being made throughout Europe. No question about that. What I'm saying is that we need to understand how are they integrated within the AI stack and the impact in competition they might have.
Nuno, thank you very much for your time.
It was my pleasure, Javier.